Welcome to the Podcast Discovery Show, the podcast that's about other podcasts, where every single week we have a book club style discussion about a podcast we recommended last week. And at the end of this show, we're going to recommend a brand new show, and you're going to go out and listen to it. And then we're going to talk about that one next week. I'm Kirk.
And I am Zach.
And this week we are talking about a show that I've listened to every single episode of, Heavyweight. And it's hosted by Jonathan Goldstein. And it's such a good show, man. It's so funny, but also like there's some heartfelt stuff there. It's a great show. Essentially, the premise is Jonathan will find somebody, and usually it's somebody that has this really compelling story, and they've lost touch with somebody else or a group of people, and he kind of goes, investigative journalism, deep dive, and he has to try to find that person and reunite them. So a lot of times sometimes it's awkward, sometimes it's amazing, sometimes, you want to cry because like they haven't talked to each other in forever and they're so happy. But that's what the premise of the show is.
Yeah, and Jonathan Goldstein actually started as an author, but has since worked on shows like Heavyweight. Honestly, is probably his biggest one at this point. It's a very popular show. He also worked on This American Life and Wiretap. But yeah, he had a career in radio for a while, and he had quite a bit of time working on writing as well. He had a debut novel called Lenny Bruce is Dead, and then he basically had a couple more novels, and he was published also through New York Times, and then something called Saturday Night, GQ, and the National Post. So he had a pretty varied and established career, but then he moved into a pretty cool show called Heavyweight.
Yeah, so he is he's the host of the show, and it's a Gimlet show. So it's funny because he's always like making fun of the owner of Gimlet or the CEO or whatever, because they're old friends and they both used to work on This American Life together. And but one of my favorite things about the show, and it's a through line through all of them, is that he always gives a phone call to his best friend, who is a nurse, and her name's Jackie Cohen. And he usually trolls her, and then she ends up every single time she ends up hanging up on him. Like, that's the thing. She'll usually say something snarky and then hang up on him. And it's so funny.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell pretty much immediately that it's going to go that way because he says something ridiculous. He starts out just saying something ridiculous, and she's like, no, this is bad.
Yeah. He starts talking about, because she's a nurse, he's like, what do you call the big toe as a nurse? Do you call it the great toe, or do you call it the big toe? And then he asks about if they call it, the pinky baby toe, or do you call it the little piggy?
Yeah, he did ask if someone had an accent, if the little piggy got smashed, like if she would say that to him. And she's like, no. And then she hung up.
She's like, no, how are you employed? And then she hung up on him. It's so funny. And it made me think about something that my son said when he was like 4. He stubbed his big toe, and he said that he hurt his thumb toe. And from then on, I have always called it my thumb toe because it's great.
He's not wrong. It is his thumb toe, kind of.
So that's my contribution to that conversation is thumb toe should be a thing. Let's get it trending on Twitter. Let's get it going.
Yeah, I don't know who's going to get that trending for us on Twitter, but yeah, it's important.
Our giant army of listeners.
Yeah, that'll do it.
Yeah. So this specific episode is about 4 kids that take a 240-mile bike ride through the Adirondack Mountains by themselves, unaccompanied by any adults, at the age of like 11 and 12. And it's a crazy story, and it's great. And it actually kind of gets a little bit emotional near the end because when they start uniting and stuff. But what do you think about the show, Zach?
I really like the show. I don't think I'd listened to any of it before. So you told me the premise of essentially that it was Stand By Me, but on a bike ride type thing. That's what it seems like to me. As soon as it's
I've never seen that movie.
Well, it's a coming of age story. 4 10-year-olds, 10 to 13, I think they said they were, going on this grand adventure cross state, doing something that probably would not be allowed for kids. Like literally, would you let Leah do this?
No, freak no. Like Jonathan mentioned, as a parent, it gives him ridiculous anxiety. But thinking of as a kid, he would love to do that, and that's exactly the way. Same with me. Like thinking of it for my kids, hell no.
Yeah,
But
I get that because it's kind of crazy to just let them off into the sunset on some bikes.
but as a kid, I would have loved to do this.
Yeah,
I would have done
no,
this in a heartbeat.
I probably would have, but I feel like I would have died. Like
Yeah.
I feel like I would do it wholeheartedly, but that I would die with that same enthusiasm. But yeah, they take off on a. They're going to what is it? It's their uncle's house that lives in Vermont.
Yeah. So
And
to give a little bit of backstory, the kid's name's Jonathan as well, Jonathan Marshall, and apparently his parents, specifically his dad, is just like this hippie 70s dad, like all about, just the laid back hippie kind of life, which is great. It sounds like he was the fun dad. He talks about like in the summer, he would ask his son, he'd be like, "Hey, it's late at night and it's real hot. How many of your friends do you think you can get together so we can go get some ice cream?" And he would like pack as many kids as they could in the van just to go get some ice cream. Honestly, it reminded me of like high school and my dad, because we would always go and do stuff with my dad. We'd go on trips. We'd go to dinner all the time. And he just loved hanging out with us.
he did.
When we were in high school.
No, and this definitely reminded me of high school. My parents, obviously, like we were way too dumb to have been let out of the house like this. But high school is when apparently I was just the right amount of dumb to be let out of the house sometimes. And
I
so,
think
yeah,
we're
that's
smart
when,
enough to hide how dumb we were. I think
Yeah,
that's more
maybe.
of what happened.
maybe they just were around us less and they forgot how dumb we really were. I don't know. It's hard to tell. But yeah, it definitely reminded me of that. But yeah, then essentially the two best friends that lived, I think, in the same street and still live close to each other, because eventually this steps out. So this is grand story, and then it steps out to where are they all now? And so two of them lived on the same street, but then two young boys just showed up and like were coming to stay at the house. And they're like, what are they supposed to do while we go on the trip? And they're like, oh, they're going too. So two random kids also get thrown into this.
Yeah, and Jonathan was actually mad. He's like, "No, man, I've got only so much beef jerky. They can't come. I don't have enough cups of noodles. This isn't going to happen." And they're like, "No, they're going with you." So that's the way it went. So
Yeah,
these two brothers, Jimmy and Mark, ended up being a tag along, and we find out later on why they ended up having to come live with the family. And but yeah.
Yeah, so basically they go on this, I think they said it took them 3 days of riding all day, and then they would land somewhere at night. The first night they stopped at what do they call it, Frontier Town? Yeah, Frontier Town. And so it's like a Western themed town. And
Sounds like a tourist trap, like in the mountains, just like it probably is.
Yeah, it probably is. But for a 11-year-old, you're like, oh my God, this is the best trip I've ever been on. And this is all told through, it's John, right? Isn't John like
Jonathan's
the lead?
the one.
He's telling the story of basically this whole adventure. Well, he's at least the first person that talks about it. And then they go to the frontier town. Then they hit a bunch of terrible weather. They have a bunch of crazy things happen. They remember amazing little details of the adventure, like going to A&W, and his friend took off his shoes, and he said that it is still to this day the worst smell he ever smelled.
Like stinking up the whole restaurant with his dirty, wet, gross 3 days of in the rain leather shoes. It was a great detail.
But yeah, this is one of those times where like we could run you through every awesome thing that happened on their story, but it's a lot better to hear them talk about it. So if this sounds interesting to you, you can hear them talking about all the little details, and it's cool to hear because they definitely do remember and hold close to them kind of different random points that happened, different little things that happened along the trip.
One of my favorite things is they actually did it. They actually made it to the uncle's house.
They made it.
And the aunt and uncle come out and they're like, "Why are you here?" And they're like, "Your dad said you were doing it, but we figured you were going to call us halfway here and we were just going to come pick you up." And they just automatically assume there's no way they're going to make this.
I would assume
And
that too. I'd be like, okay, just have the car ready. We don't know when it's gonna.
and also, I really liked the impact that this had on pretty much all of their lives. This, you like you said, it's like a coming of age moment, and it really was. Like even for Jonathan, the main character in this story, he talks about how it almost like gave him a determination to do, not give up, and to just keep pushing through stuff. And he became a lawyer and all this other stuff. And when everyone thought he wasn't going to be able to do it, I thought that was a really interesting angle to the story.
Yeah, one of the things that really caught me as like they were talking about it is how differently each one of the 4 perceived it. Each one of them had a very different experience kind of in their memory of the trip, and then also how that impacted them moving forward. Because the neighbor, I cannot remember his neighbor. Were they both named John?
Jonathan and John. Yeah.
Yeah. So the neighbor who was there, not the main storyteller, but
Jonathan
his
and John,
friend.
hosted by John Goldstein.
Yeah, there's like, a lot of Johns going on.
So many Johns.
But he basically doesn't remember any of it. He doesn't remember any of the details. He remembers making it. He remembers going on the trip. But okay, which one? Jonathan's the storyteller. The first
Jonathan's the
right?
storyteller.
So
John's his best friend.
Like tiny details, like what they ordered at the A&W when they got there, and like all the random hills that they were on, and like the weather,
the headboards at the Frontier place,
all of this stuff. Like he remembers it so vividly. And John, it's more just like, yeah, I remember we did it, and like, but that's kind of it. Because then I think that he kind of just got into. He was doing concerts. He was, I think, the oldest out of the group. So like he was right at the age of being a teenager, and so he was just kind of like, okay, yeah, that was a fun trip and everything, but he moved on like as a person quicker. And then the whole kind of premise of Heavyweight, if I'm gathering this correctly, is it's making lost connections essentially happen. You know, it's tying up loose ends of life.
It's not hardline that, but it's almost every episode is that.
So in this one, I think Jonathan and John talk fairly often. But
I think they're still friends.
They had never talked to Jimmy and Mark since taking this trip. So that was a crazy thing to imagine, is just your kid, you go on this crazy adventure, formative thing, and then you lose touch with them completely for 45 years. Like kind of mind-blowing to think about. And so that's where the payoff of this show really comes in, because you're like, then you start to think about like, oh, what would it be like to do that? And then obviously Jonathan Goldstein goes out, and he said he had to make hundreds of calls to try and find these people.
I love how he had bits and pieces of those calls. They're like, no, there's not a Jimmy or a Mark that lives here. You know?
Yeah. But he found them. He found both Jimmy and Mark. I mean, because he found Jimmy, he was able to find Mark because they were brothers. But essentially, then you get into what is maybe equally as interesting to me is kind of how this impacted everybody differently. Because, like, I believe Jimmy's the one that was in Vegas, or he was in somewhere west, and then Mark was the Florida teacher.
Yes, I believe so. I believe so.
They were brothers, and they eventually told you that the reason that they went on this trip is because their mother got MS and Parkinson's at the same time.
Yeah, she was getting very sick.
She had to quit work, and she had to essentially be at the hospital all the time, and it essentially fractured their entire family. And the father apparently cracked and like completely abandoned them, and they still don't talk to him. And that is why they were sent to this house on that trip. So there's so many random little like life elements throughout this thing that you're just like, this is so crazy for like a 10-year-old to experience. And there was even a little bit of animosity between Jimmy and Mark, the brothers, because like just everything that happened with the family, it sounds like just kind of shattered everything. Jimmy said that literally this was like the only good summer of his childhood.
Yeah, it was pretty heart-wrenching, to be honest. I mean, you know, and a lot of his stuff's out of their control. And the thing that stuck with Jimmy, and is so sad in a way, because he of course he remembers the trip and he thought it was awesome, but the thing that he remembered even more fondly was spending time with John and his family, like hanging out with them, just seeing a family dynamic that was working, and just, you know, spending time with parents that he was never able to really enjoy.
Yeah. And so it really does come back to all of this really kind of deep human stuff. These emotions that everybody can kind of remember a little bit, feel a little bit. Because yeah, Kirk talked about when we were in high school, that's when we kind of felt like we were going on these adventures. Because at one point they started thinking about it and they're like, you know what I miss was the freedom, just the complete freedom of everything. And I thought about that when they were talking about this entire story. And it's like, when was the last time you felt like that? You know, that like that high school or being a kid feeling of just nothing.
I thought about that today. I was like, what did I ever have an experience similar to this? And I think the closest one would have been that road trip that we went on right after high school, when we went to Myrtle Beach.
Yeah. Or the trips to Roxanne's.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those trips that we took were kind of it, because we didn't have any plan really aside from just going to a place, and it was just hanging out. And so it is a very like kind of special moment in your life to have that kind of freedom and to feel that just winging it idea.
Yeah.
And I don't know. They just talk about so many things that you're like, wow, this. So basically the story that starts out like just this coming of age story. And it's insane that it happened. Like it's insane that a bunch of children rode their bikes 200 miles.
Paper. His uncle was like, well, heck, we need to tell the paper about this. So the paper came, they took pictures, and it was in the local paper. And of course they bought a bunch of copies, and John still had copies of it. And he sent them to all of the guys, because apparently Jimmy and Mark had been telling people about this story, and most people didn't believe them because they didn't have any proof of it. And so now they have proof of it. So now when they tell people, they may be like, see, I've got a paper. It says I did it. There's my picture.
And one of the most like hit home moments of this, really, that's what this show is about. Is kind of, it reminds me in a lot of ways like This American Life and really great shows like that, where you start to see a pattern forming, but then they really can't execute like the finale of it, where it's like, oh wow, and then it like wraps it. And when they all got their pictures, you could hear like almost like childlike excitement come out in their voice. And then then Jonathan Goldstein connected everybody on the phone, who literally they hadn't talked to in almost 50 years. And you could hear them kind of like get excited about it. They started getting a little bit giddy.
You could hear the nostalgia, dude. Like you could hear it in their voice.
It had a really great payoff for kind of like everybody getting to like reconnect about something that was so important to all of them. So I really did enjoy the show. It's that perfect balance of like, it's funny, both the host and like the story was crazy, but then just the emotional tie-in at the end is just, it makes it really great.
So like I said, I've listened to every single episode of Heavyweight, and it's weird because he names it usually a person's name, so you don't know what the story is about when you listen to it. He always names it after a person's name, and it's funny because a lot of podcasts you want to pick and choose. You're like, okay, this looks interesting, this doesn't. I'm not going to listen to this one. I'm going to listen to this one. This show, I just trusted it, and every single time it would get me, man. And I'm looking at some of the other episodes. One of them was great because he had his friend whose name's Gregor. And this dude, he was such a dry humored, hilarious, but like, it seems like he would be obnoxious to be around guy. And apparently he always felt, he felt jealous of Moby because it was his friend. Apparently he grew up with Moby, the very famous artist, or, musician.
Yeah, the Moby. And not that there's like Moby. There's one Moby. There's no name what I mean Moby Dick, but other than that, there's no other reference to Moby ever.
But
just
like
Moby.
Apparently, Moby came out with an album that had a lot of like how would you call it? There was a word for it. It was like folk music mixed with like African folk music and stuff like that. And apparently Gregor let him borrow that album, and then Moby basically sampled the whole album and made his biggest album ever from it.
Really?
And what Gregor wanted is he wanted that album back because Moby never gave it back to him. And so they travel all the way to Moby's house. Moby has no idea why they're there. And there's this whole like thing, and it's so funny.
Did they end up
And
talking to Moby?
yeah, no, they end up going to his house, sitting down, and of course, Jonathan Goldstein's hilarious, and he called himself like the mediator, but he's had some weird like Jewish name for it because he's very Jewish, and he's always playing into it. It's great, and it was just such a good episode. That was one of my favorites. There's a list of like the top 10, but this one was cute. There was one. It was called Beverly and Van, and it said Beverly's granddaughters wanted to know why she always spoke about Van, a man that she loved platonically, but supposedly not romantically. And then he has to and both of these people are dead, but both of their grandkids remember their grandparents talking about each other. And it's such a cute story. And they end up finding almost like love letters, but they were just like best friends, but they almost, became, more than that. And it's just it's a cute story. And of course it's so much digging because both of these people are deceased, and it's just going off their grandkids. I mean,
how you even form a story around that is mind blowing.
I'm telling you, it's great storytelling. Jonathan's humor is so dry and fun. There's not even that much of it in this, and it's peppered in throughout the stories. It's not like a comedy podcast, but that's what I see from it, and I appreciate it from it. Was that?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't call this a comedy podcast. He's just a funny person. So sometimes it's got some humor to it, but it's not like a comedy podcast.
But yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and if anybody hasn't listened to it, you should, because Heavyweight is a great podcast, and trust me, any episode. Just listen to it. You'll like it. I'm telling you.
Yeah, no, it's definitely great. I will be recommending that for a long time. So for next week's recommendation, I feel like all of us need a little bit of uplifting. 2020 has been something. It's been a very interesting year. Ooh. And it's time for an uplifting one. Just because it's 2020, we're all living through it. We're all in it together. Let's try and live our best life.
We're all in it together alone.
Yeah, we're all alone together. So I found a show. I'd heard about it a couple times on Reddit because every once in a while people throw out just like one of these posts essentially saying, okay, I need something. I don't feel like my mental health's not great. I don't feel great. I need something to listen to that'll pull me out of it. It's a fairly common request on the subreddit. Actually, it's interesting, but
this is on the podcast subreddit.
Yes. And so what they a lot of times recommend is a show called 10% Happier. And 10% Happier is originally a book. And the book is written by Dan Harris. And Dan Harris was an ABC News anchor who literally traveled to the Middle East after 9/11, who did all of this stuff to try and become the best news anchor he possibly could. And then he had a panic attack live on air on Good Morning America. And so literally it caused him to re-examine his entire life. And he went down this journey of self-discovery. He kind of explains it from like mega churches to shamans. Like he just went on a journey of self-discovery to try and be happier. And that is exactly what his show is about. His show is about trying to be 10% happier. And essentially, he talks to a bunch of people who are very influential in meditation and trying to think positively to try and positively affect your life. So the episode I'd like to recommend is, and it felt like just very topical for right now, it's episode 295, How to Be Grateful When Everything Sucks. So I felt like that pretty much wraps up how we all feel. So
yeah, and I think we all could use an episode like that, a discussion like that, a podcast like that, where it's just kind of refocus. How can I be grateful during this unprecedented time, as everyone likes to call it?
Yeah, the novel coronavirus is getting us.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm excited to listen to that. I'm excited to have some more strategies on how to be grateful during this time, because everything does suck right now.
It does.
And when this comes out, it'll be right after a very contentious election. So I don't care what side you're on. We're going to feel probably just gutted no matter where you're at. So this is something else that we're going to need and be very timely.
Absolutely. All right.
And remember,
there's always more to discover.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Discovery Show. We would love for you to get in touch. We have a Facebook group called the Podcast Discovery Club, and our Twitter is @thepdsofficial. We also record the show live every Friday night at 8 o'clock on Twitch. We would love for you to be part of the show while we're recording it.
If you want to support the show, we have a number of ways you can do that. From our Patreon to our affiliate links, they're always linked in the show notes. In the end, you support the show just by listening, and it means the world to us. So thank you so much for being a part of our journey.
This was a podcast from the Podfix Network. You can check out more shows like it at podfixnetwork.com.